Okay, another Mrs. H psychology clip to help you with your exam skills. This is dealing with AQA psychology, and specifically here it's paper 1, the social psychology section for this clip. The question is on social change, and we are going to be looking at this particular question, which is using an example, explain social influence processes in social change. So let's have a look at this question. What I found was students were making two common mistakes. First of all, some people not using an example. And for this question, an example should be used throughout your answer. So a real life example used throughout your answer, and we'll have a look at that in a moment. And also the other problem and where marks are lost is the answers were very vague, no specific terminology used, or very little specific terminology. And that's really important to show that you've sat and learnt this stuff. Okay, so this question is for 6 marks. Key terms to use. Well, here with my students, I've given them this bit of information. So here, we've got a lot of new terminology that we should be using in this. So if I just quickly go through some of that, this is what we do to cover social change. So, for example, it's important that the minority would, because this is really about minorities forming social change, starts off with a minority. First of all, they've got to draw attention to their views. In other words, they've got to try and get commitment. So that's a word you must use. Maybe using your augmentation principle. In other words, showing some self-sacrifice. Can you relate that back to your example? Give a real example of somebody sacrificing. So, somebody giving up their time, somebody actually putting their life in danger. So in order for their cause, whatever the cause might be. Okay. You should be mentioning consistency. Okay, one of the key factors of minority influence is consistency. So we need to bring that in. You could expand on that with diachronic and synchronic. In other words, consistency over time and consistency with the group saying the same thing. You should be talking about deeper processing, right? So in other words, individuals try to understand why the minority maybe have that viewpoint. So bring in conversion here, that we are using informational social influence. People start to question and think, well, maybe they are right, the minority are right. And therefore, once they start to question it, they process it more deeply, in other words, trying to understand that point of view. And eventually, some of them will be converted, okay, to get that minority's view. With this deeper processing, we should be throwing in another key factor here, flexibility. So in other words, not being dogmatic, being open to discussion, being able to see opposing views and be able to argue against them. And again, try to relate it back to your specific one example. As we talked about conversion, internalization, obviously, and remember you're saying that it's very slow at first, but as it gathers pace, it builds momentum, and we get this snowball effect that more and more people come on board with this way of thinking. And we get a critical mass shift, so the minority will eventually become mainstream. We can talk about legislation there possibly as well. You can also throw in things like social cryptomnesia, where people know that change has happened or know that they have a belief but they don't know where that's come from, and so on and so forth. So plenty of key terms there that must be included in this. And obviously you're using your specific example. So we have a look what was on the mark scheme from this sample paper, sample question paper. So they've got social change refers to the change that occurs in society, not on the individual level. So it's nice to layer one. So consistent, flexible, committed, right, with the augmentation principle, through social cryptomnesia and snowball effect. Gradually the minority turns to the majority. So governments and lawmakers will then bring about legislation to help with that, to help the majority become effectively law. So so there are changes in the law, and people have to obey. So we've got normative information, we've made reference to the processes as well. You could refer to people like Moscovici with the blue-green slides study. And here they've given you lots of different examples. So recycling, green issues. At the moment it's all about plastic in the oceans. and that is becoming a majority issue with people picking up litter and so on and so forth. Smoking in the past, changing views on homosexuality in the past, votes for women, and so on and so forth. So pick something, and just when you're going through these, make reference. Think about that. How can we apply that to your specific example? And there is the mark banding. Okay, so the levels, level 1, 2, 3. So for level 3, which you were all aiming for, marks 5 to 6 for this particular one, knowledge of the role of social influence processes in social change is clear and very accurate. An example selected is relevant, and a description of this is thorough. So it's clear, coherent, specialist terminology used, and you need to be referring to your example throughout in order to access that level.